Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussion, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2022. That brings us to that title, which was released by Criterion at spy number 1113. This is the work from 1982. The filmmaker is Ann Hui, and the name of the work is, and again, please pardon me for my very poor pronunciation, but it is Taoban no Hui, or in English, it is known as Boat People. This is the work from 1982, and the filmmaker is Ann Hui, and it has its incredible, compelling cast, people like George Lam and Season Ma and Andy Lau and others. And it is the work which is called, and once again, please pardon me for my very poor pronunciation, it is Taoban no Hui. And I understand this can be translated into English as Into the Raging Sea or Into the Raging Seas. However, I also understand that this film, under past releases, including this current Criterion Blu-ray release, is given the title in English of Boat People. The film Boat People is a remarkable, outstanding, challenging, shocking, and moving and quite an involved work. And I also use the word involved to suggest that it makes probing questions posed to the viewer who is watching the work, and really with a lot of almost confrontational scenes that I think are designed to challenge and designed to provoke thought and consideration and questions as well, questions upon questions, while providing, as I say, an intensely a film with intense scope and a lot of deep-rooted and perhaps in one's conclusion, disturbing consequences that are part of its overall concept design and story and plot. And when we're speaking about the story and plot, of course, we can focus on the setting. This is, of course, this is some years, we understand, after the establishment of communist rule in Vietnam. So we understand this is probably around the very tail end of, or the late 1970s, the tail end thereof. And also we are focusing in Vietnam, and specifically one of the main characters is this Japanese photographer, Akutagawa. And what we see him, or we follow him in his various interactions with, say, government officials in Vietnam, as well as his project in trying to catalog or capture certain street scenes or certain other scenes of various aspects of the life in Vietnam and the city life, as well as the school life and cultural life, and perhaps along the way those pictures that he shoots and the film that he captures for purposes of maybe creating some kind of article expose or some kind of other type of photograph work to be displayed to the world, or that's the concept anyway. We begin to question almost immediately the inherent nature and the authenticity of the various subjects that we see our main character, Kutagawa, the photographer, engage when at the very outset. For instance, we see him at a particular setting involving a group of children, and it seems like the children are in a type of peaceful or tranquil state, and a peaceful type of communal state, whereas perhaps later on in the film, one can begin to question, including the photographer himself, one can begin to question whether indeed those scenes were indeed authentic, or perhaps they might have been a bit more or perhaps quite more, they might have been hiding a much darker and much more disturbing truth than had met the eyes of the observers at the time of the initial encounter. So these and other questions begin to emerge as the plot propels itself forward. And again, we are following this Japanese photographer. And not only do we see him engaging with the various photographic scenes that he's shooting, including parades in the street that involve troops or soldiers or officers. And also, we see how the crowds are reacting or seeming to react to these particular scenes. We also see how how ordinary working people are asked to engage with certain aspects of labor or work, including, for instance, cleaning up certain areas that might be infested with leftover mines or bombs that are a type of unwelcome residue from the immediate past encounters of a military strike force or other military actions or other types of attacks and the like. And so we see the community, the daily life community of ordinary people dealing with these incredibly, potentially frightening circumstances, while at the same time trying to deal with the everyday situation in life that living in this period in time in Vietnam brings with it. And that brings us to a particular storyline involving our main character, or one of our main protagonists, the Japanese photographer, and his encounters with a young woman and her family and her mother and also the siblings, and how there is a close relationship that is forged and developed between the photographer and this young woman on the one hand, and indeed to her family by extension. And through this relationship, the photographer begins to learn and realize that perhaps what he is witness to in the context of the communist rule Vietnam that he is currently a guest in, what he is being witness to are perhaps not the scenes of the authentic truths that are really confronting the everyday citizens of Vietnam at this particular place in time, as symbolized by what he sees and what he perceives to be the plight and situation of this young woman and her family. And indeed, throughout the film too, we see how certain scenes and scenarios that might seem to emerge from daily living, daily life, or the needs or necessities that are coming about because of such daily living or daily limitations, how those have consequences that directly affect her and her family and her immediate family circle. And we see those plots or subplots play out in a seemingly subtle, say, beginning, but then they develop and develop and develop until they reach a type of conclusion. And those conclusions are very vividly portrayed, sometimes maybe violently portrayed, but this is part of the context of the film, the preservation of a type of what might be described as shock value, but shock value that is applied purposefully in order to make a point about the type of extreme nature of a lot of the dire situations that really seem to be confronting the ordinary citizens in this particular community during this time and place. So this is a very key component as it's shown or amplified or as represented through the relationship between our main characters, this young woman and the photographer, and also along the way through various other connections that we see either through the family or through the photographer, and also his connections with other people, including government officials and also their close-knit circle, etc., etc. We begin to see some kind of unraveling, if you will. For example, the stories involving his relationships with certain members of the government bureaucracy. There might be some hidden agendas that may or may not be revealed. Maybe those hidden agendas might be revealing something of another type of authenticity or truth about the philosophy of some of these figures in government that are doing what it is they are doing or expected to do what it is they are expected to do, and how they really believe it or not, depending on the circumstances, and how those belief systems might lead to a sense of betrayal as the various, say, government externalities really begin to kick in and begin to affect the individual personality and soul, almost in a soul-crushing type of way, and how we, as the viewers, and also through our experiences with the main protagonist, the photographer Akutagawa, we see and we witness these as he is seeing and witnessing them play out in front of him in real time. Also, by extension, we also see other characters, other subplots involving maybe a certain bar setting, a certain type of movement, for lack of a better phrase, maybe an underground type of movement, or a type of activities, shall we say, of characters that are trying to escape this particular regime, communist ruled Vietnam regime, and control in society. They want to escape and want to leave for other places, other countries nearby, for a sense to try to achieve what they perceive to be a type of sense of freedom or liberation outside of Vietnam. And therein lies the connection to be made with this particular English language title of Boat People, because what this implies is having to try to secure a spot on a boat that will then take these refugees outside of the country to another place in the world. And so therein lies the link with that particular use of the English title, Boat People. And we see too how this is focusing in, at least in certain subplots and certain characters that we meet, how this is becoming quite a direct plot point, because this becomes, for a number of the characters, a very important or very significant, maybe motivating factor that leads them along their particular character arcs, again, from their subtle beginnings as they emerge when we watch them as the film begins, all the way through to quite seemingly quite shocking, devastating, excruciating set of circumstances, leading to a type of further motivation, an intensified motivation to want to try to achieve this goal of escape, and what the consequences are, what the losses will be, what the circumstances, and what the overall effects will be, and whether or not that goal and motivation is indeed achievable, or whether it is or it will always remain a type of elusive or unattainable type of dream or fantasy. It really depends on the various characters that we come to meet along the way, including, of course, our main character as well, the Japanese photographer. And we see throughout the course of this very, I think, wonderfully structured work that has this very episodic nature that leads itself very nicely to a type of flow of various strands of plot and character development. We see at the center, or one of the centers, the evolution, if you will, of the perspective of this outsider turned insider, in a manner of speaking, our protagonist, the photographer, the George Lamb character. And we see how all these events and circumstances and feelings affect him overall as well. This is a very powerful, tragic work that also has tinges of hope and triumph, but also at the same time a type of realistic, or maybe a type of realistic sort of assessment that is always permeating the atmosphere when we watch this. And it doesn't flinch, it doesn't shy away from these very intense, very thought-provoking, and oftentimes leading to disturbing areas of further thought and consideration types of questions. And this is, I think, part of the challenge and the compelling nature of this particular work. It's a very shocking work in a manner, in a lot of ways, and I think the complexities of this particular work, I think, cannot be, they must be emphasized, and they must be stated with a full sense of room for ample discussion. And one of the great things about the Criterion release, in my view, is that it does acknowledge, through a certain degree anyway, it does acknowledge through the supplements some of the, shall we say, quote unquote, controversial points of this film, or points that have been generally regarded over the course of time since its initial release, since it even opened at Cannes Film, or it was shown at the Cannes Film Festival, which we'll talk about in the supplement section of this video. Even from that point onwards, there have been aspects of this particular work as it's been received by certain areas of the general public and also the film critics circles, how this has been received in some areas to have maybe certain points of controversy. And this is very important to not just to be aware, but also to acknowledge and also to maybe have that as part of the overall consideration when one is exploring this work. And I'm very appreciative of the Criterion Collection supplement because, as I say, to a certain degree anyway, and as far as I have been able to identify it, they seem to be addressing these points, albeit, of course, with I think a reasonable helping of nuance, and I'll try to get to that later. And then finally, I should say too that this is also a very powerful example of the filmmaking nature and style and philosophy of the filmmaker Ann Hui. Her approach and style has this almost on the ground feel. It has this, it could be described maybe in some circles to have a sort of leaning towards a style that could be described on the one hand, or maybe a hybrid approach as a type of verite style on the one hand. But at the same time, it is also very stylized in terms of how it presents character, how it sets up certain shots. But the style is never distracting. By any sense. On the contrary, it is always meant to show us directly the type of information that needs to be conveyed for purposes of the soul, the heart and soul of that particular scene. Whether it be a type of human connection, whether it be to try to display a sense of irony or cynicism, or whether it be trying to apply a sense of realistically approached hope, a sort of tempered feeling of hope or aspiration, as it were, the achievement or the hope to try to achieve a certain dream, and what the challenges are and what those challenges mean in terms of the psyche as well as the physical health and well-being of the particular characters that we see, that we are witnessing trying to achieve those particular ambitions that they have, including escape. But this is always presented through Ann Hui's approach and cinematic style in this direct way, and therefore it's a very approachable way, and it's using aspects of cinema language and grammar that I think are very easy to understand from the very get-go. And at the same time, they're telling a story that is, of course, very concretely within a specific context, and always has its, I think, its implications in the political, as well as the geopolitical, and also the ramifications also that were playing itself out again upon its release and beyond, I should say. So, but Ann Hui as a filmmaker at the center of this. She not only holds her own, she holds her own and then some, with a sense of confidence, a sense of sweep, in terms of the regard, the cinematic regard that she obviously espouses in terms of her innate and very high level, her high level cinematic talents. And indeed, those cinematic talents are extraordinary. And we will see more examples of that in a discussion of Ann Hui's work and her role not only in Hong Kong cinema, but just cinema writ large, in a discussion of the supplements. But this Boat People, this is yet another great example of the powerful work of Ann Hui, and it remains so powerful, and it remains very much a story about a certain period of history, while also being very almost chillingly timeless. And that is one of the great powers of this work. Again, this is the work from 1982. Again, pardon me for my poor pronunciation, Taoban no Hui, or as it is often referred to in the English language, Boat People. The Criterion Collection has released this work, known in English as Boat People, at spine number 1113. And this is the Blu-ray edition, and according to the Criterion release itself, this is purported to be based on restoration, 4K restoration. According to the booklet, which I've already removed for purposes, in advance for purposes of this discussion, it says, towards the end, it says, Boat People is presented in its original aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1. Restoration was undertaken by the Criterion Collection. This new digital transfer was created in 4K resolution, etc. and then also with a monaural soundtrack. So I must say that this is a film that it looks and sounds quite spectacular, and it really I mean, it's an oft-used expression, I know, and I apologize for using it, but I really believe this. It really felt like it was just leaping off of the screen, in a manner of speaking. It was so striking in that way, while at the same time there are many scenes that rely on the application of nighttime and darkness and shadow. I mean, there's a film that's not totally shot in these nighttime or dark shadow lighting schemes. I mean, there are also brightly lit scenes as well. But this type of comparison, or this type of dichotomy, in a manner of speaking, becomes a very important aspect of the visual style and scheme. The idea too of the clandestine nature of a lot of the activities of the characters, as well as a sense of claustrophobia that is physically present, as well as maybe emotionally or spiritually present as well. That is also part of I think, the overall cinematic approach of Ann Hui and company. This, I think, comes through in the visual presentation and stylings that I think feel very vivid, very fresh, and very effective in terms of this presentation from Criterion and company. So, and the sounds too, I think, are very they're filled with a sense of energy as well, and style. And as I say, this is a film that has moments of calm and also moments of high intense energy, almost in a tragic or violent way. So therefore I can say that from my own viewpoint, this is a really incredible and welcoming addition to the Criterion Collection in terms of this release purported to be based on this new restoration. It is a fine, fine restoration in my view, and I'm very, very pleased that Criterion was able to release it in this way for this particular Blu-ray edition. So this is, again, yet another wonderful example of the restoration efforts with regard to cinema, and specifically with regard to Ann Hui's work, Boat People. Well done. If you haven't seen it already, I think this is a great way to catch up with it or to experience it in terms of the flashes of energy, as well as the earnest nature of the scope and style and the emotional heart and soul of this work. Well done to Criterion for being able to do it in this way for purposes of the 2022 release. And of course, as with many other Criterion releases, in addition to the film itself, which is of course the main attraction, we also have other added benefits to this particular release in the form of the supplemental materials. There are quite a number, and so let us go through what they are one at a time. First up is a contemporary discussion described as being from 2021. This is approximately 26 minutes. This is a discussion where Ann Hui is sitting together with Stanley Kwan, and they are having a conversation about Boat People. So Stanley Kwan is the assistant, or he was credited as being assistant director to this particular film, and also he does give examples during the course of this great conversation about where his specific efforts went and what particular scenes. There's a one scene in particular that involves a boat. I mean, Boat People is it's often referred to in English as Boat People. And so we do have a very significant scene involving a key character and a boat or boat voyage, or circumstances and the consequences of such a boat voyage. And so Stanley Kwan mentions, and Ann Hui too also follows up in the conversation about how he was tasked with handling or being in charge with the organization and efforts, including a number of extras that were part of this very highly involved scene. And there's a really very earnest and warm, engaging exchange between the two of them in this conversation about how they recall at the time this was maybe a somewhat high-stress situation for Stanley Kwan, who again had to arrange everything, had to control everything. And maybe there was a point where Ann Hui, the director, was putting a little bit of time pressure on him, asking how long it would take or something to that effect. And Stanley Kwan was very much into the detail because of a highly intricate scene, a highly intricate setup or number of setups. And so they recall how maybe he might have lost his temper a little bit with her at the time, but at the end, this was also a sign of respect, or An Hui was, of course, just wanting to show her respect for his very valuable works, and of course, vice versa too. This conversation is where Stanley Kwan is recalling with great fondness the memories of this particular time, this particular occasion. It's and working with An Hui and what his observations were about her working methods, what she remembers about this entire project, this entire production, because it was a highly involved production process, including the locations, including also what the potential political ramifications were for a lot of the locations and a lot of the support that the production received, including from certain sources in mainland China. And we will get to that point a little bit later when we talk maybe about some of the comments made here in the context too, or in relation to the opening, for example, or not the opening, but the release, for example, at the Cannes Film Festival in the early 1980s. But these points are really, really important, and it's so great that the two of them are sitting here and speaking about these and other points in this great, great, great conversation. They also speak too about what is often perceived to be An Hui's early filmography output that also touches upon certain themes or situations involving Vietnam, or maybe the relationship, shall we say, between Hong Kong and Vietnam, or other types of geopolitical based relationships. So certain other works are mentioned, for example, Boy from Vietnam, or Story of Wu Viet from 78 and 81 respectively. And then if you take those works, early works, and then this current work, Boat People, that is often considered a type of trilogy of sorts. And the trilogy, with its various thematic connections, could be described as having one of those connections or thematic connections be stories that have some kind of anchoring or some kind of dealing with the stories of refugees, refugees from Vietnam into the Hong Kong area, and what the effects of such refugee movement can be, not just in terms of the movement details itself, but also the after effects and also the reactions from, say, external cultural points, as well as the internalized emotional and psychological effects and states of mind and states of being that each of these stories brings along with it. Of course, this is not just exclusive to these sorts of stories of political or political related situations giving rise to refugee movements, but also writ large or on a universal level, the stories of the human condition. And Boat People, of course, is fitting in, I think, so thematically close with such type of, say, overall viewpoint of this core set of works, or one of the core sets of works within the context of An Hui's filmography. She also speaks to, and she and Stanley Kwan touch upon, the story development process of this, because this is a story, and this was something that was written in terms of script writing. However, An Hui does mention how the script writing process for this work took a considerably longer time than was something that she was used to in terms of her other films or other working methods. And there was something about really needing to get the story right. There might have been some loss, artistic loss, that could have been incurred had the film been rushed into production without giving it that extra bit of time. So An Hui does present, I think, a really in a very clear and quite a revealing way these ideas of, or these episodes of the creative process, the artistic creative process. And oftentimes it takes time. And oftentimes, too, the amount of time can really be, for a lot of projects, a make or break type of moment. But again, with her perseverance and that of her other collaborating artists, we ended up getting enough time spent on the development of the story and script, leading to the production details that led to the final outcome that is Boat People. And then they also speak too about the casting process and how they cast certain of the performers in these very crucial key roles. And they speak, for example, Stanley Kwan and Ann Hui, they speak about the casting of Kor Miao, which is in a very important role, and also the very important role of Susan Ma, her character, and what the casting process was, and also too, where there might have been a rehearsal process, or I'm sorry, excuse me, audition process, or where there might have been relying upon local actors from the area. And then, speaking of which, too, another anecdote that is brought up in terms of the production and casting is where An Hui and company were relying on, say, actors from the Hong Kong film industry, where they were relying on, or where they were relying on, say, the Chinese mainland China film industry, or where they're relying on maybe by an extension of that latter part, where they're relying on local actors, because this is a film that is also shot to a certain degree, to a certain significant degree, on locations, or certain locations anyway, and that type of location or stand-in locations setting use also called for a lot of outdoor shooting, and also a lot of use of extras as well. So there is this interesting mix or blend of say, various or different film industries, maybe situated quite closely in terms of geographic proximity, of course, but still quite distinct in their own manners. Which is something that An Hui also mentions as a type of retort to one of the questions that was posed to her in the Cannes Film Festival press conference, which is also part of the supplements here. But in any event, we have distinct connections with various film industries coming together for this production. And so that, I think, shows itself in terms of details involving the process of choosing the various actors for each of the roles, both primary and secondary. And then also the length of time, too. It was mentioned how there was much time that needed to be taken in order to really develop and redevelop the script. And so that meant, too, that maybe certain plans that had been made for production at the quote-unquote first stage might have fallen through because of the extra time that was needed. And one of the circumstances of the extra time was that there was another actor, we understand, that was cast in the main role of the photographer. But then, due to the extension of time that was needed for the script development, those plans had to fall through. And then, as a type of replacement, George Lam, a very famous actor, performer, singer, etc., George Lam, came in and filled in the role of the Japanese photographer, which is a very interesting role. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about George Lam's approach to the role when we get to another supplement. But that leads to that very interesting a type of casting. And George Lam, by the way, adds a type of earnestness to the role. I mean, he is there and he has to observe things and internalize them. And it's sometimes, I can appreciate how that would be very difficult to show as an actor, but he is able to do it. And there is the urgency that is expressed, even where he might not necessarily be expressing it in words. You can tell in his look and his eyes and what it is he seems to be emoting through those looks and glances that make up the very fiber of his being, and which lead him, we can understand, to his character making the various choices that his character ends up making that have huge ramifications and consequences going forward. So well done. It's a really inspired choice and a great performance from George Lam. And then, of course, I spoke a little bit about some of the places that were used for the shooting. And so Zhenjiang is mentioned here as well. Also, I forgot to mention to you another very important and quite a remarkable piece of casting is also Andy Lau and his characterization and what he brings. It's another very vital and important and very significant character arc. And we spoke a little bit about the significance of the English language title often given to this film of Boat People. Well, I think that significance definitely comes through when we examine his particular character, or the character that he's portraying, the arc of that particular character. It's a really powerful performance. And also there's more discussion between the two of them here, Stanley Kwan and Ann Hui, about the collaboration between the two of them. Ann Hui and her working style, and also some of the choices that were used in terms of the photography and capturing these large vistas as well, which are very important. There are also a lot of stresses too, a lot of pressures that were being felt by all the creative persons on the production, on Hui, of course, as well. But this is part of the working relationship that she has, and so it becomes a really almost endearing part of An Hui's persona as a filmmaker and as an artist extraordinaire. And I love too, there's some other moments that we'll see in other supplements where we see this persona of An Hui, and it's regarded with such great affection from other figures in the Hong Kong cinema community as well as elsewhere. And we also see it expressed here from Stanley Kwan, and also their warm, lovely conversation between the two of them here. So also, I mentioned a little bit about the reaction that this film had, especially upon initial release and initial showing at places like Cannes, etc., Cannes Film Festival, and how they describe or they recall about how the film had been pulled from competition at the Cannes Film Festival almost at the last minute because what they understood to be complaints made by the government of Vietnam, and how in France or at the Cannes Film Festival they wanted to cause as little, say, cause as little, say, friction between French government and the Vietnamese government, excuse me, at the time. And so that meant for the Cannes Film Festival organizers deciding to pull this film from main competition, although it was still screened, as we understand. There's also resistance, or there may be protest, we understand, from certain politically left-leaning voices or viewpoints that were apparently focusing in on the aspect of the production, both people, and the production links to production support in a direct way from cinema-related producers and sources, support sources from China, China film industry, mainland China as well. So this becomes a point too that is a very critical one about here. An Hui reveals one of the conversations that she had early on in the production process or the planning process of this film, both people, with one of the high-level producers, and how it was one of these high-level producers who had told her that from the producer's point of view anyway, and this is according to what An Hui says today here in this conversation, that what she was told by this particular person was that one of the purposes of the making of this film was to, and again, was to have a film that somehow included what was regarded as anti-Vietnam propaganda. And another point that An Hui recalls that was part of this discussion that she was told from this producer was whether or not to consider whether or not to make specific reference to the Soviet Union, because as we know, this film deals with a certain specific geopolitical related history, and that geopolitical related history is directly figured into the, at the time, quite what could be described as very tense relationships between and among various countries and nation states. So, for example, and perhaps quite directly, China and Vietnam, and of course, saw some very tense relationships that were maybe seen in the aftermath of what is referred to as the conflict between China and Vietnam, the Sino-Vietnamese War, a sort of border conflict. It's often described as a border conflict, but it also is very deeply rooted in the politics of the Cold War at the time in this particular part of the world, and the various viewpoints and relationships that Vietnam had with, say, Cambodia, what China regarded with regard to Vietnam's approach towards Cambodia, and whether or not the Soviet Union would somehow step in or somehow provide a support to one nation state over the other in this quite complex set of geopolitical tense relationships. and I say tense, but it's of course a very, very grave and serious and significant set of relationships that forms the historical backdrop for this period of the late 1970s in this part of the world, and also in the context of the Cold War, and also in terms of the context of the specific national histories. Well, this is the backdrop against which this film Boat People was being made, not just in the contemporary times, but also in the subject matter of the film. And so the fact that An Hui is revealing that these things were being told to her directly by this high-level producer, who is obviously representing certain maybe mainland China interests, let's say, that means that therefore the filmmaking, or at least one of the viewpoints that could be said to be related to the production, are these anti-Vietnam viewpoints, and also the possibility of making direct reference or not to the Soviet Union, which is itself, that consideration point itself, makes the the Cold War tension connections all the more, I think, relevant and clear. Now, the issue or the question then becomes, at what point or to what degree, if at all, the filmmakers directly involved, that is An Hui and maybe by extension other of her core filmmakers like Stanley Kwan or others on the production of Boat People, to what extent or degree does An Hui and others, if at all, espouse same or similar viewpoints? And I think this is a very nuanced and quite complex issue. And if we go to other supplements, I think we can find an answer to that particular question. After all, we understand that filmmaking is a very complex thing, and it can be also potentially filmmaking can be somewhat potentially quite complex, and also quite difficult to navigate, especially in the context of after production reactions to the film that have a geopolitical connection that is very significant and very deep and very contemporary, that the Cold War tensions of Vietnam and China and Cambodia and others definitely had during this time. And this was still fresh in everyone's minds in the early 1980s. So, but then the question is, then arose in, say, another supplement, what An Hui herself believed. And we'll get to that Cannes press conference, because it is a fascinating historical document, if nothing else. I mean, it is many things, but it is also a fascinating historical document. And she does provide, at the time anyway, what her answer to that is. And I think it is still quite consistent with what she reveals here in this particular discussion. So for these and other reasons, this discussion between Stanley Kwan and An Hui, I also mentioned too, I forgot to mention that the discussion then leads to their viewpoint about the Hong Kong film industry, because they do regard themselves as being members of the Hong Kong film industry, and they see the way in which this film fit into what is often referred to as a type of golden age, or a type of a new wave type of period of intense and wonderfully established cinematic creativity in the Hong Kong film industry during the 1980s, starting in the early 1980s. So Boat People falls in that period. And so how they perceive the industry to have changed over time to where it is now, or how they perceive it now. And there are certain differences that they mention. It's very fascinating outlook. And so this, and for other reasons, this conversation between Stanley Kwan and An Hui is, I think, essential. It is complex. It also brings to light the challenging nuance that I think is associated with Boat People. And it's always an important part of the conversation. So I'm really glad that that was part of this conversation. A great conversation. Again, approximately 26 minutes. But that's not all, because then let's go to what we've been referring to a little bit so far up to now, which is the Cannes Film Festival press conference from 1983. I mean, it's described as being May 1983. This is overall 29 minutes. And we see a little bit of the setup of the conference itself, or the press conference itself, the mics and the moderator, and there's of course some of the questions are fielded in the French language, and then some translation occurs, and then answers are provided from An Hui and also George Lam, who's also present, in English, and then it's also translated where necessary, etc. So there is also that time there as well. So it's not this this almost streamlined, edited form, but it's almost like the raw footage that was shot at the time that's being presented, for the most part anyway. But that doesn't detract or take away anything from the content or the discussion. I mean, on the contrary, it's really nice to get what is it's a actual authentic, living, breathing historical document of something that was shot. Again, the questions and answers of the Cannes Film Festival press conference in conjunction with the screening of Boat People. And this is very, very important because there are references made to the film being pulled from main competition due to what is described as protestation from the Vietnamese government, as well as what is described as pressure from left-wing sympathizers. And this is also due in part to, we understand, two maybe basic aspects that were seen to be sources of these sorts of criticisms. One being the depiction of Vietnam in this particular work, Boat People, as seen perhaps by certain figures from the Vietnamese government, and two, the way in which this film's production has certain specific connections with the film industry from mainland China. So those are the two sources of what we understand to be the reasons behind these particular cited criticisms that we understand maybe perhaps Ann Hui herself mentions it in this press conference how she is not privy to the what might be referred to as the backstage politics of the Cannes Film Festival. She doesn't know. She's been asked, but she doesn't know specifically why it might have been removed. But these are the generally accepted reasons as to why perhaps that decision was made by whoever had the power to make that decision at the Cannes Film Festival. But in any event, that is touched upon, and An Hui does mention to her, is given the opportunity to talk about why she believes the story of refugees from Vietnam into Hong Kong was so important for her as a starting point, not only in the context of this film, but also in some of the other works that were described here and elsewhere. And so she sees this as a very, a story that is filled with a number of humanist elements and stories about the individual struggle and certain dreams and ambitions and what the external circumstances and forces are that might either support that or prevent that, depending on which stories are being told. And this leads to her interest in an eventual contribution to the development of what becomes ultimately this work, Boat People. And to be specific, she talks here about how maybe at early stages of the story development, there might have been more emphasis on the actual part of the story that involves the voyage on the boat people in question and their voyage on the boat. Whereas in the final product, while there are references to this concept of the refugee passage and the voyage and the trip, the boat people in question, and while there are these visual cues in that way, the film could also be described as maybe not focusing on that per se, but focusing on the circumstances and story steps leading up to that particular component of the route of the refugees from Vietnam and the stories that come along with it. So it's a story before this particular passage. Also, there's reference to the fact that the reporter, the main character reporter, is Japanese, and An Hui mentions here some reasons why she wanted or she agreed to having this particular aspect to the character being a Japanese photographer. And she also mentions to she makes reference to the involvement of China or mainland China in terms of this. She mentions a little bit about how there was some oversight as far as the script review, and that led to maybe some insisting on removing what could have otherwise been included involving scenes of sexuality. But I think An Hui acknowledges at this conference how, as an artistic choice, she could go along with the removal of such scenes because she understood, at least from her conception of the product here, which is that the film wasn't necessarily serving any purpose to have those scenes included, whereas also it could really have a powerful message behind it, or a powerful type of existence behind it, with or without those scenes. That's the implication of her statements here. So, and then also the idea too that the sources from mainland China industry also were providing, say, liaisons with extras, because this is a film where the shooting, outside location shooting, involved relying on extras. So this was very important. Also, the reliance on special effects technicians from the China film industry as well. So these were some of the links that she reveals here as well. So this is, I think, a really revealing more, again, especially when one is considering the type of criticism that this film received, precisely because of, or what was perceived to be, the quote-unquote connections with mainland China. So here she reveals it in this way, in this type of way of the context of practical production issues. So whether you are okay with that, or whether you seek to pursue that particular, say, discussion or debate further, again, that is, again, up to you or the particular viewing experience that you might have. But in any event, this is, I think, a really important comment that Ann Hui reveals. Also, she talks too about how, from her perspective, mainland China regards this particular film as what they quote unquote foreign film. It is not a mainland China film per se. It is a Hong Kong film. So it is a Hong Kong film towards which the China film industry is providing certain lines of support. And so that is the viewpoint that Ann Hui understands the situation to have been. And so that is that leads then to a question of whether or not, therefore, this film can be said to be totally free in terms of a type of political agenda, if at all, if it could be said to be totally free from a China-oriented political agenda or not. And I think Ann Hui makes a really compelling case for it not being the case, at least from her perspective. She looks at it as a work of art. She looks at it as a work of art that she can, what she says, understand. And I think she's talking about the way in which creative forces, as well as objective viewers, audience members, can relate to a work of art in terms of individual empathy. And I think this concept of individual empathy could either be, of course, directly linked with political leanings, or it could alternatively be totally separated from political leanings. And I think my hunch is, or my impression of Ann Hui's comments here, is that her answer is leaning towards the latter rather than the former. In other words, a type of coupling off or delinking from type of political consideration of the film, rather looking at it through the lens of the individual and the ability to express empathy by virtue of watching or experiencing this cinematic representation of these stories of these people. So that is, I think, her approach, and that might help to further elaborate upon or embellish or support that line of thinking that was referred to in the 2021 supplement that I discussed earlier, between the discussion between Stanley Kwan and Ann Hui. Really, really important stuff. So it's a nice crucial link between the contemporarily made comment and also the more recently made comment. I think there is a consistency there that one can say exists. And then turning to other details of the production, again, going to the Cannes Film Festival press conference here, talking about casting of George Lam, and also how George Lam maybe was known or more known at the time for what is described as maybe comedy entertainment films, TV dramas, and so maybe to see him in this very serious role in this very serious film might have been an initial surprise, but he handles it quite well, and I think that also lends a really powerful dynamic to the work. It's not like his character or George Lam or his character is out of their depth per se. But what I'm saying is there is a type of earnestness to the role that is so critical in the way in which Kutagawa, the photographer, views the world. And it is through this earnest portray or earnest perspective that he obviously has, and this is due in large part to the way that George Lam and what he brings to the table, how he forms the character. This is, I think, a great way to understand why it is that he makes the decisions that he does throughout the film. So that's a really great. And also, I should point out too, there was another question that was fielded, asked by a reporter here about. The reporter was asking Ann Hui about trying to maybe answer for or make some statements to represent China film industry. And An Hui, I think, handled it really well, but she was very confident and forceful in her response in saying that she doesn't consider herself to be a a filmmaker from the China film industry. She's not a mainland China filmmaker, but she refers to herself or understands herself to be a Hong Kong filmmaker. And that is very different, she says. And so she has to explain why it is different. And so therefore she has no way of making any type of insider account as to the state of the China film industry today. But rather she can speak only from her own experience as a Hong Kong filmmaker. And the like. So I thought that was a really interesting detail that the conversation this press conference turned into. So in any event, my friends, a very important historical document, and yet another means by which one can get further understandings and insightful insights into the inner workings and thinkings and philosophy of An Hui and her approach towards this film, and also her approach to cinema overall. Very, very critical and important stuff. So please check out the Cannes Film Festival press conference as well if you can. It is approximately 29 minutes. The supplements don't end there, though, because they continue, and my goodness, do they continue? They continue so well. The next supplement is a work from 1997, approximately 1 hour and 1 minute, and this is As Time Goes By. This is a type of documentary or portrait, if you will, of An Hui and also her close-knit circle of friends and family, contemporaries, as it were. And this is such a really fascinating story because, once again, for those of you who might be coming to this work or maybe approaching the work of An Hui for the first time, watching the earlier discussion is a great place to learn more. This press conference that we just spoke about is a great place to learn more. And also this work, As Time Goes By, is another wonderful place to go. This is 1997 work, is, as I say, focusing in on her, focusing in on some of her friends and associates, and talking about growing up in Hong Kong, talking about early memories of family and childhood and surroundings, even down to the details and observations that she and her other friends might have had at the time growing up, in terms of details of housing and where they lived and the places in Hong Kong that they lived and how those places have maybe changed over time or maybe not have changed depending on what we're talking about. They also talk about education, An Hui, how and what were the details that went into her education, what it is that she was interested in studying and reading from a very early age on to her schooling as it progressed, leading up to her college level studies, etc. And during this time, too, there are some very fascinating details that emerge from her and her other friends about where, at what point, or in what context were they receiving their education in the English language, or where they began to learn or receive their education in, say, other language as well, how they had to maybe adjust or turn their attentions to Chinese language studies or English language studies, etc. Again, as they're growing up. And this also has a link too with the way in which waves of what might be called nationalism, waves of nationalism in the context of their living and their lives in Hong Kong, and also, of course, with the international community, including the relationship with China. This comes to the fore in a lot of points of their lives, An Hui's life as well, and it comes in the context of their education and her life and her own education. And then she speaks too about how this maybe how maybe some people might have been oblivious to the various political movements, or maybe that might not have been the case with some of her friends or associates or other people that she was working or not working with, that she was growing up with or learning with at the time, and also the eventual discovery of, say, the political leanings of newspapers and how some students might be well aware of this or maybe quite oblivious to this particular point, and also how this connected to maybe or coincided with various political based movements or events, and specifically riots, the Hong Kong riots in and around 1967 is referred to as a reference point here. And the idea too of an awakening of political consciousness on the part of Ann Hui and her friends and contemporaries through their education. It is all. This is one part, but of course, as we know, growing up can be a very multifaceted thing. And another one of those facets for Ann Hui, as we hear in this documentary, is her appreciation and love for the arts and literature and performance. She mentions, for example, her love for reading serialized martial arts novels, and she was really fascinated with this. And it's interesting to think now about her filmography and maybe how that love for the martial arts novel, the epic novel, might have found a voice in, say, some of her other projects in her filmography when she became a filmmaker. And also she discusses her life and her family. And one of the details that does emerge here is her mother, and how Ann Hui didn't know until a little bit later, when she was a little bit older, that in fact her mother, who's also featured, her mother is ethnically Japanese. And so this also brought with it a lot of tension in terms of how her mother viewed herself, how she might have been viewed by other people in the society at the time. Maybe she had to hide certain aspects of her ethnic identity or her ethnicity. And then indeed how this might have revealed itself through a certain strained relationship between mother and daughter. But then An Hui realizes maybe a reason for that was due to this particular background of her mother that, as I say, or that's revealed here, was became known to An Hui a little bit later in her life. And so this adds, I think, another very fascinating detail about maybe the way in which one can understand the approach that An Hui has, not just to her films and her filmography and her approach to cinema, but also the idea that was expressed in other places, which is this ability, maybe because of her background and her experience with a type of multi-ethnic setting or backdrop as it relates to her own personal family experience, let's say, how this might be said to be very informative in terms of how she approaches certain specific stories, again, from the viewpoint of an artistically inspired empathy with the individual that is not always automatically associated with the geopolitical. And I think that is implied. Again, I don't want to suggest that this is overtly mentioned in this work. It's not, but I want to say that one could, or at least I can reasonably make that type of at least hypothetical supposition. And if that's the case, it does feel consistent with what I perceive in terms of my observations, as I've mentioned them thus far here. And so for these and other reasons, and then also then she turns to her life, and then she turns to why she turned to film ultimately, which is a great story in and of itself. So overall, this is a fascinating document into the life and times and education and spirit of An Hui, and also the reasons why she ended up becoming the great filmmaker that she is. So as time goes by from 1997, please check it out if you can. But that's not all, because then we get another great documentary. It's described as from 2020. This is approximately 2 hours, or 1 hour 58 minutes. Keep Rolling. Now, I had not seen this documentary until I was very fortunate to get this in the mail, this Criterion release. And I must say that I was enthralled. This is a great documentary, again, focusing in on An Hui and focusing in on just many things about her life and times growing up, her own family history and background as well, how she came to Hong Kong from Northeast China when she was a little girl. And so therefore that adds even more to that idea of the sort of multifaceted background when it comes to her and her life experiences. We mentioned a little bit about her mother as well, so that is also referred to here as well in a very poignant way. There's some scenes too in regards to An Hui and her relationship with her mother that are so emotional and very powerful that are included in this Keep Rolling documentary. So please check this out if you can. Also, during the way too, we see how her films and some of her films, a lot of her films in her filmography, are used or can be seen as being examples of how they can be illustrative of various aspects of her biography and her approach. So, Golden Era or Song of the Exile, as time, etc., and also as time goes by as well, are reference points that, and other films are reference points throughout this documentary that again shed more light and insight into the life and times of Ann Hui. And then she talks about her relationships with her parents and her mother, and the sort of strict upbringing, the ethnic background of her mother that was mentioned. She mentions too, or there's reference about her education and growing up during this period. She mentions how she was a diligent student, but she was also not totally bereft of experiencing bullying, etc. But that she loved to be. She has this wonderful, charming intellectual streak about her. How she, maybe if she goes to have a drink with friends and gets drunk, she would love to like recite Shakespeare. And that's such a lovely anecdote. And then also that leads to her entry into the film industry and her work and her assistant work with filmmaker King Hu, and how that led to her own development and then establishment as a creative force and filmmaker in her own right. And my goodness, this then leads to a great discussion into aspects of what can be described or often described as the Hong Kong New Wave, and she is an integral member of that particular movement that then leads to a great discussion of the Hong Kong film industry and the way of making a film then versus now. And also then that leads to great anecdotes and insights into her own approach. She acknowledges and she admits that she does maybe have a tendency to get angry somewhat quickly on set, maybe lose her temper somewhat quickly, but that is again part of her persona as an artist and as a creative force. So this is, for these and other reasons, this documentary is a marvel. This is an eye-opening marvel. I saw it twice. I've seen it twice so far, and I want to see it again and again. I saw it a second time, and I picked up some more details that I failed to pick up on first watch, and so I want to maybe watch it even more to pick up more details. And again, for anyone who is new to the world of Ann Hui and her filmography, this, I think, is such a great primer and introduction to her life and her films. There are some great clips as well from her films, as I mentioned. But all in all, and therefore, all in all, it is great. So great. I'm so glad this is included as part of this package. So please check it out if you can. The documentary from 2020, Keep Rolling. Now let us go to the other aspects of this release, including the great booklet and the presentation. Oh, before I do, let me just say one other thing, which is, I think on the back of the box here, and also I think on the website of the Criterion Collection, I think it also indicates that there is a trailer as well included in the supplement section. Now, I checked the supplements. I couldn't find any trailer, so maybe that is a mistake on my part, or maybe I wasn't looking in the right place, but I checked and I couldn't find it, at least on the copy that I have. So it says trailer, but I couldn't find it. If you have a copy and you're able to find a trailer, then I hope you enjoy it. But in any event, that is the just overview of the great supplements that can be found here. Now, with other things too, we have the great presentation, the cover art design here, which is, I think, representative of the film itself, obviously. And I should say that the art is credited to art directors Sarah Habibi, Eric Skillman, designer Eric Skillman. And so we have this, I think, great rendition with the font choice and also that type of motif that is also continuing on into the great booklet. I'm so happy because it is a stapled booklet. It is robust. It has a number of writings, not just one. We have two. And so the first is Persistence of Vision by Justin Chang. And then the second is Becoming Refugees by Vinh Nguyen. So the first essay, Justin Chang essay, Persistence of Vision, I mean, this is This is so great. I mean, these are two separate essays, Persistence of Vision and Becoming Refugees, each coming from a, uh, a similar yet unique positioning in the context or approaching An Hui's work and boat people, but that coming towards what seems to be like a common goal. So slightly different directions or starting points, but then reaching the same or ultimate goal commonly. So I love that kind of combination. And so we have the types of cinematic techniques that are then, of course, embedded in a context or a discussion of the moving portrait of history and politics, but it's always never losing sight of the human emotion, the mapping of the human heart, as it were, in these individual stories or stories of individual people and their struggles and their persistent natures as well. A type of examples of a strength of will and strength of character, even under extremely adverse circumstances, etc. So, these two essays, Persistence of Vision and Becoming Refugees, are again yet more essential components in the context of the Criterion Collection release, and also in the exploration, the possibilities of exploration of this film that Criterion has very kindly provided when it's releasing this work, Boat People. So great job. I'm so happy with these essays, the contents of them themselves, as well as the great robustness of the booklet. It also has some wonderful, great examples of stills and representations of the film or aspects that otherwise echo or mirror parts of the film. So this is great. Please check it out if you can. Of course, it's strongly recommended that one watches the film first, and then one can read the essays in one's own time. So in that order, I think it's well worth it, because the essays do go into specific detail of the plot, etc. So it might be worth doing it in that order. So I would like to conclude here by saying once again that this is a very, I think, extraordinary release, high quality as always, and it is filled with so much information. Of course, the information and the supplements are they provide great information of the backdrop of production and also reaction and release, as well as the focus on the filmmakers, and of course the spotlight on the great Ann Hui and her personality, her lovely, warm, and very witty and intelligent and so artistic and imaginative nature about her that is on full display. And it is a force of cinematic nature, she is, and her persona is, and her energy is, and it comes through when we speak about or when we explore or enjoy the spotlight that is shone upon her and her career, like we did in a number of the documentary type supplements, or when we see it shone on her in the context of her work here, Boat People, and we return to this powerful and haunting and challenging work that An Hui and company have provided. It is a really extraordinary achievement on a number of levels, and so I hope that as many people get a chance to check it out where possible. I think the Criterion Collection has done an amazing job to make that possibility even more possible with this great release. Again, at spine number 1113. This is the work from 1982 from An Hui. This is the film Boat People. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.